Hello and welcome to another session on appreciating poetry. We shall begin the next poem in memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Arden. Now, before we begin or move on to the poem, a small introduction about the poet and also the poet on whom W.H. Arden is speaking about. That is W.B. Yeats. Now, first and foremost, the poet himself, W.H. Arden. He is one of the most versatile and prolific poets of the 20th century England. He was born on 21st February 1907. He was born to a medical family. His father was a doctor and his mother a nurse. He lived in an atmosphere of science, or the home atmosphere was scientific, and it was intended that Arden should become a mining engineer. But it so happened that he turned to poetry. He had typical middle class education, and he later joined the Christ Church, Oxford. And he also worked as a school teacher. After his education, he worked as a school teacher when he spent a vacation or a holiday in pre-Hitler Germany. He was a school teacher. He worked as a school teacher for a short period or a short while. He also did a stint in some documentary films. Another important thing about him is during the Spanish Civil War, he drove an ambulance and he served as a stretcher bearer on the Republican side. So all this constituted what Arden is. He has seen the horrors of war, and that shaped his poems and his attitude to life. In 1935, he married Erica, who is none other than Thomas Mann's daughter, and in 1939 he migrated to US, and later he became a US or American citizen. One very interesting fact of Arden is that he, being an English poet, had two passports. One that of as a British citizen or British passport, and another his American passport. Now, that's just an interesting fact about Arden. Okay, this event, that is his becoming an American citizen, was in fact a turning point in his life. Now, these 30s, the 1930s, were in fact the most productive period in his career. He wrote 3 plays in collaboration with Christopher Isherwood: The Dog Beneath the Skin, The Ascent of F6, and On the Frontier. The poems, now a little bit about the age. The poems of 30s, the style of the poems of the 30s were mostly epigrammatic and conversational. You will find that in Arden's poetry as well. He identified himself with the Marxist philosophy or Marxist ideology, and this was inspired by his search for spiritual order and moral responsibilities. Arden became the foremost among the group of British poets who came into prominence in 1930s for their poetry of social protest. Arden was the first modern poet to draw his ideas and imagery from the material of Marxism and psychoanalysis. He and his group of writers who were noted for their social protests were bitterly criticized by several critics. They were together called Max Ponday poets, and this name was given to them by Roy Campbell. Roy Campbell criticized them. Now, Max Ponday is actually the name of several other poets, like you have Louis MacNeice, Stephen Spender, Cecil D. Lewis, and all their names combined, and they were together called the Max Ponday poets. The name was mockingly given to them by Roy Campbell. This is also, they are also referred to as this 30s group of poets were also called the pylon poets due to their industrial imagery, or due to their use of industrial imagery. They are also sometimes referred to as pink poets because of their partially left-wing sentiments. They are also called pink poets. Now, Arden is remarkable for his versatility as well as ingenuity, and the poem prescribed to your course of study by the Calicut University is in memory of W.B. Yeats. Now, let me come to the poem, a little bit about the poem, and then we'll speak about the subject of his poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. From the title itself, you understand that it is an elegy and it is written in memory of the great poet W.B. Yeats. Now, what is an elegy? Before we move on, what is an elegy? An elegy is a poem that laments the death of a person with intense reflection on the broader sense of human mortality. It is derived from the Greek word elegus, a song of bereavement sung with a flute. A traditional elegy, if you look at a traditional elegy, it is written in elegic meter. You will have alternating lines of dactylic hexameter and pentameter. Now, one very important kind of elegy is the pastoral elegy. Now, pastoral elegy, you will find pastoral settings, the pasture, okay, the field, and you will find the characters who are shepherds. It begins with an invocation to the muse, the goddess of muse, that is the nine goddess of poetry, the nine goddess of art, and goddess of muse is one of the goddess of poetry. The elegy, especially pastoral elegy, it begins with an invocation, a prayer to the muse, and it contains elaborate description of nature, and it ends with the acceptance of the inevitability of death. In English literature, since 16th century that is, an elegy meant a poem of lamentation written in any meter. But traditional elegy is normally written in dactylic hexameter and pentameter, alternating lines of dactylic hexameter and pentameter. But in English literature since 16th century, it is any poem of lamentation written in any meter. Some of the few examples of English elegies are Milton's Lycidas, which was written on the death of Edward King, Milton's friend. Adonai by Shelley, P.B. Shelley, written in memory of John Keats. Tennyson's In Memoriam, which was written in memory of his friend Arthur Hallam, and Matthew Arnold's Thyrsis, written again in memory of his friend Arthur Hugh Clow. Now, one distinct type of elegy, which is quite different from the ones that I said right above or said right now, is Thomas Gray's elegy written in the country churchyard. Now, if you look at the other elegies which I mentioned just now, you will find that it is all written in memory of a particular friend or a particular person, grieving the death of a particular person. Even in our elegy also, in the elegy in memory of W.B. Yeats, Arden is grieving or lamenting the death of Yeats. But in Thomas Gray's elegy written in country churchyard, it is a universal one. It is mourning the death of man as such, that man's life on earth, the impermanence of man's life, death as an inevitable thing. So it is, in general, it is mourning the mortality of man as such, and it is not about a particular person. So that is one thing that you have to remember or bear in mind. Now, let's move on to the poem. In memory of W.B. Yeats is a typical elegy, and it is on the death of a great poet, W.B. Yeats, written by one who greatly admired him and who was greatly influenced by Yeats, and that is W.H. Arden. So Arden is giving or writing this poem as a tribute to his memory or to Yeats's memory. It is an elegy in the strict sense of the present usage, that is lamenting the death of a person. It is a formal, sustained poem of lament for the death of a friend, a beloved or a friend. Unlike in modern or in other modern elegies, there is no abandon of grief or overindulgence of grief. In some of the modern elegies, you will find some sort of artificiality in it. There's either too much of grief or too little grief. But here it is like just fine, just perfect. And there is a lot of restraint, of course, but it has certain majesty, it has certain power and dignity about it. There is nothing artificial or labored in the grief that the poet expresses, and it is totally different from the pastoral elegies. Now, you have not studied any of the pastoral elegies to give you a comparison, but when you start studying the pastoral elegies, you will find that this pastoral elegies, you will find a little bit of artificiality. Or especially in grief, in the grief or lament, you will find a little bit of artificiality, but that such thing is not there in this elegy. It's a modern elegy. It has all the qualities of a modern civilized man's expression of grief at the loss of a dear, revered person, a respected person. It is intense but restrained, inward, not loud, and it is genuine. It's a genuine grief. Truly, Arden feels that the loss of W.B. Yeats is indeed a great loss for the world. Now, the poem, if you look at the poem in your textbook, if you look at the poem, you'll find that the poem is divided into 3 sections. You will find a change of tone from the first stupor of grief to the acceptance of loss and the final hope that Yeats' life and poetry will inspire and enable who live or enable us to live as sensitive human beings. Now that is one structure of elegy. It starts by expressing grief. Elegies normally starts by expressing grief and slowly it moves on to accepting, because death is inevitable, right? So it accepts death, and eventually that is the conclusion. The conclusion, you will find that you'll find hope, and by after accepting the death, you will find hope that everything will be restored, everything will be all right. That sort of structure is what you find in elegies, and this also has a similar structure. In the beginning, it starts by expressing intense grief. Slowly it moves on to, in the second section you will find that moves on to accepting the loss, and in the third section you will find that the poetry of Yeats will continue. It is a hope. The poet is hopeful and or going in peace. Arden is in peace. He feels that his grief is now lessened or reduced because he is hopeful that the poetry of Yeats will continue to inspire many people, and it will help us or enable us to live as a sensitive human being. The poem opens with a detached account of the circumstances and settings of the poet's death. You find that the whole place is in the grip of winter, the frozen state of the physical world in the dead of winter, and the dead cold of the poet's mortal remains, that is his dead body, are set side by side. So there is a parallel, or the Arden brings in a parallel between the world outside, the physical world outside, the environment outside, and the cold dead body of the poet, that is Yeats. So he also touches upon the politics of the day. So this is typical of Arden. Arden's style is like that. Though it is an elegy, again I told you this Arden is a poet of social protest, and hence you will find the contemporary happenings also in his poems. So by using, it's like there's a lot of metaphysical conceits here. By using speaking of Yeats, Arden also touches upon the politics of the day, the dead calm. It's this the day or the time in which Arden writes this poem is a period where the world is gripping under the monstrous hands of the world wars, and there's a lot of degeneration, a lot of terrifying disasters, impending dangers. So the atmosphere is not that of calm and happiness, it is that of separation, one nation hating the other nation. There's a lot of insecurity, a lot of crime, and even in Yeats's poems, I will be coming to Yeats's poems and the age in which Yeats lived, you will find that the age, he was trying to warn people, Yeats was trying to warn people of the terrifying effect that future holds for all of us if it goes on in this manner. You will find a lot of Marxist ideology in both the poets Yeats as well as Arden. Now coming to the poem, back to the poem, this was a period of widespread immobility because of the war. It was somewhat similar to the lockdown that we have right now. A lot of restrictions because of the impending war, and everything is, there's a lot of immobility. Nobody is moving. This is portrayed by the whole the airports being still. The flights are grounded because there is a lot of snow. It's snowing. And the lake is frozen, so there's a lot of immobility. You find those images both in the rural, from the rural as well as the urban things being still. There's a lack of movement in the poem. If you read the poem, we also find the elegiac concept of universal mourning, which is implied in suggesting that the day of Yeats' death was a dark, cold day for the entire world. So Arden does not move away from his topic, Arden does not move away from his theme, but keeping the theme, he also alludes to the happenings in the society. That's the style of Arden. Okay, so indirectly alluding to it, he using several metaphysical conceits. He keeps his theme. The theme is the death of Yeats and how the world looks at the death, or the world will lose such a great poet. But at the same time, Arden indirectly touches upon the politics of the day as well. Now, who was Yeats? Next question is, who was Yeats? And how has Yeats's poetry been an inspiration to many poets, especially W.H. Arden? Yeats is a national poet of Ireland. He could be said to belong to both England as well as Ireland, because his poetry follows both Irish and English traditions. He wrote in English and was influenced by Spenser, Edmund Spenser, P.B. Shelley, the Pre-Raphaelites, but by birth he was an Irish poet, and he had the Irish blood in his veins, so he fought for its liberation. He was not exactly involved or actively involved in the Irish politics, but his poems had a great influence in the liberation or partition of Ireland from England. His great works are The Wind Among the Reeds, Crossways, which is a collection of poems, which is mostly, you will find Arcadian, Indian, Gaelic, Irish themes, and most of the famous poems would be the Stolen Child. In this collection you will find a very famous poem, Stolen Child. The collection is the Rose, in which the most famous poem, which you may have studied in school or at school, especially very famous celebrated poem among children, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. That poem is included. Now, Easter 1916 and the Second Coming are two celebrated poems of Yeats. It is Easter 1916 is a poem on the Irish uprising in 1916 against England, and Second Coming is based on the Christian concept, not just the Christian concept. It is also, you have the Muslim concept, the Christian concept. There's also a Buddhist concept there. The Christians, they believe in the return of Jesus, And in Buddhist concept, it is the next Buddha who would, who will return to restore Buddhism when it is lost, or when Buddhism becomes lost or corrupt. So it has a very religious theme, second coming. It's mostly Christian in nature. Another important thing that you have to remember about Yeats is Yeats was greatly worried about the way the world was working, the world was moving on, industrialization, urbanization, the rise of science, the advancement of science, which led to skepticism and antagonisms. It is Europe, which was mainly predominantly Christian in nature, has started questioning Christianity. Christianity has started losing its hold over the European countries. Well, this can be seen again in an indirect way when Arden compares Yeats's body as a province. Arden is touching upon several things. Arden touches upon the Europe under the terrifying times, that is the world wars, where it starts losing its colonies, it starts having trouble. Several nations, the allies, the allies and the Axis powers fighting against each other. And also you will find the religion being questioned, Christianity as such. So there's a parallelism between Yeats's body and Christianity, which had control over Europe, or which had great influence over Europe. It starts losing, it starts decaying, or it starts degenerating, just like Yeats's body. So there are a lot of indirect suggestions, not just European politics but also religion, along with it goes parallel with Yeats's death. Okay, so his influence on other poets is truly great. He lived during a period or an age of violent upheavals, both in political, social, as well as literary life. It was an age of ups and downs. It was the last decade of 19th century, and there was a complete breakdown from the agrarian form of life. Industrialization and urbanization gave rise to many problems like overcrowding, housing shortages, rise in crime, moral degradation, and also rapidly or increase in the rapidly standards, there's an increase in the sexual morality. Okay, it was lost. There was a lot of adultery, lot of demoralizing happening. And in the matters of religion, as I told you, there's a lot of skepticism and a belief that whether God exists or not is unknown. We don't know. So the rise of science had started to question religion as such. And even it was also a time when Freud's psychoanalysis, psychology came into prominence. Amidst the problems, Yeats, all these problems, Yeats wrote his poems, and this brought light and darkness to an age which was engulfed in darkness, or the dark ages. Yeats's poems brought light That's what we can say. So let's begin the poem. In memory of W.B. Yeats. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So let's just look at the first few lines, 1 to 5. It deals with the day of Yeats's death. The state, the physical world is all frozen, and it is in the dead of winter, and this is paralleled with or by the immobilization of Yeats's body on the day of his death. So you find the whole physical world is a standstill. There's immobility, it's bitter cold, severe cold, and this is paralleled with the dead body of Yeats, which is again cold because there's no life in it. And if you look at the as winter as such, winter, what does winter suggest? Winter suggests the death of what? Death of nature. Winter is actually death only, right? Winter is the end of a cycle. The death of what? Death of nature, right? Nature sleeps, nature goes to sleep, and it is reborn only in spring. So you will find that everything, there's not a single grass would not grow. The rivers will be frozen, and the birds fly far to the to warmer countries. Migration and hibernation. The animals, they go into hibernation, they hibernate during this period. So it's almost like nature is dead. So likewise, there's a parallel between the death or the physical world, the immobility of the physical world, with that of Yeats's immobile dead or dead body. The dead of winter. Now again, look at the word, the dead of winter. He disappeared in the dead of winter. Now, a winter is normally cold, of course, especially in European countries. It's very cold, it snows. And Yeats died on January 1939. And January is certainly a very cold, wintry month. But was it really cold as Arden suggests? We do not know. Like Arden suggests that it was very cold, it was wintry, but perhaps he has used this severity to show the grief or the loss of the great poet. Not just that, he may have used this to show the extreme, immobile, dead body of Yeats as well. So whether it was really or whether it was severe, bitter cold, we do not know, as what is mentioned in the poem. Dead of winter, bitter, bitter cold. He disappeared in the dead of winter. So the now if you look at the images shown in the poem, the deserted airports, the brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted. So the airports, the deserted airports and the brooks frozen, the lakes frozen, shows Arden as a modern poet, especially the airports. He draws images from city life and brings in the facts of modern life, as airports are deserted because the planes are all grounded owing to bad weather. And in the evening, as day ends and gives way to night, the mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Now look at the words dying day. Mercury sank, dying day, dead of winter. So all this brings in that image of Yeats' death, and the in the evening, so you find that the barometers or the thermometer fell further. It was extremely cold during the daytime. It was extremely cold, but as it gave way to evening or night, it became further cold. It became colder. There is an increase in the intensity of the cold, a drop in temperature caused by winter, which is, again, as I told you, death of nature. What instruments we have, that is, all the instruments that record weather, all agree that it was a very, very cold day. Arden thus draws parallel between the dead and mortal remains of Yeats and the weather outside. Thus, he sets a tone and environment for his lament of a great person. In 1939, when Arden wrote this poem, which I told you earlier also, when you study Arden, you can't just simply study, okay, this is a poem, an elegy on the death of W.B. Yeats. No, it's not just an elegy. Arden is a poet of social protest. So, and he uses a lot of conceits here. Using Yeats, the dead body of Yeats, he parallels it with the conflicts happening outside, the cold, degenerating, the decaying body of Yeats is parallel with the decaying and degenerating Europe as such. Europe has started degenerating, the world wars, okay, and the Cold Wars. All that has resulted in a degeneration of humanity. So that is being paralleled, okay. And when he wrote this poem in 1939, this Europe was infested with the winter of discontent, the same disillusionment that Yeats had when he was alive, and he had to live through it. There's a poem, a prayer for my daughter, and also Second Coming, which I had already discussed. All these are personal poems which reflects the gloom of the poet, his fear of a stormy future. W.B. Yeats had written poems which he was very apprehensive of how the world was going. So he was warning. His poems were mostly warning to to humanity or to the world that if the world is going to move on. It shows Yeats's gloom and disillusionment of the way in which the world was working. Now, Arden uses Yeats' dead body, and he parallels it with the world outside to show that degenerating, decaying image of Europe and European politics, which Yeats also had to live through, which Yeats was disillusioned and disgusted with. So he uses that by paralleling it with Yeats's dead body. So Arden uses the themes that Yeats used in his poems: the image of stormy future, the cold, cold weather, and the death of Yeats, which can also be predicted as image of a large, complex organism, Europe as such, dying in the grip of winter, that is the present age. So through the weather as well as the physical remains of the poet, Auden reflects the modern life and laments both the death of the poet and death of culture and humanity. Thus, we see the elegiac convention of universal mourning brought with politics and humanistic overtones. This is quite a style of Auden. He suggests that the death of Yeats was a dark, cold day for the entire world. Here the poet, using poetry, speaks of the impact of Yeats's death and it had on his admirers. The day Yeats died was a day when everything stood still, as if caught by the cold, icy hands of death. The frozen brooks, deserted airports, and disfigured public statues, all this give the impression of immobility, which is a sign of death. Immobile, not moving. Okay. And if you look at the phrase disfigured, the public statues, it means it has, the base meaning would be the snow has covered the statues completely, that they look disfigured or they are out of shape. But if you dwell a little deeper, it stands for the threatened state of European politics. Disfigured public statues. Okay. And in the next few lines, he uses nature. Well, of course, he has been using nature right from the beginning, but he uses it to suggest how cold it was. Like, for instance, the mercury sang, which I had already spoke about, and which suggests a dead drop in temperature because of the winter, and it also indicates death. Winter is a death for nature. So, but then look at the next few lines. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. So, in the first part of the first section, which is a mournful section, it describes the coldness of death. Okay, and the environment reflecting it too, that is the frozen river, no one traveling, the public statues disfigured. All these conditions symbolize the loss of activity or the loss of energy, and it is shown in Yeats's death. At the same time, far away, the wolves run, the peasant river flows outside the rest of civilization. So, in the first section of the first few lines of the first section, you find there is immobility in nature, and this is parallel with the immobile body of Yeats. It is trying to, or through this, Auden is trying to show or portray death or decay. But if you look in the next few lines, he is going against the conventions of the traditional elegy or the pastoral elegy. In a pastoral elegy, all of nature stands still, just like in the first section. So it will continue throughout the poem. But here, he reverses it. He brings in or he treats it ironically. That is, the conventions of a pastoral elegy are treated ironically. The wolves running through the evergreen forest and rivers following their usual course suggests the uninterrupted flow of life. Okay, he says that, like in the pastoral elegies, which tells you that nature is also in a standstill, it mourns the death of the poet. Here, Arden suggests that, or states that, nature goes on in its course indifferently. It does not care for the poet or anyone who has passed away. So here, Arden uses nature in a different way to treat the power of poetry. Poets may come and go, but their poems are forever. He may die, but his poetry outlives him. So, through the woods and through the rivers flowing their usual course, okay, that's what we, or that can be, that is suggestive of poetry, the power of poetry. Just because the poet has died does not mean that his poems has come to a standstill. That is why he purposefully brings in this sort of philosophy, where the death of a person, nature does not care for whoever dies. Nature goes on its course uninterrupted. Just like that, a poet, when he dies, he will die, but his poetry will continue. Just like the wolves that go through the evergreen forest and the rivers that flow their usual course, the poetry will get the poetry of the poet will get circulated. It will continue to live. It outlives the poet. Now look at the next few lines. By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. By mourning tongues means the death of the people who mourn the death of the poet. Mourning tongues, who are sad or mourns the death of the poet. Those people, they mourn the death of the poet, of course. They are sad that the poet died, but they also celebrate the poet's verse, the poet's poems. That is why it says, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Okay, the mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems means the people, they are sad. His admirers are sad that he has died, but they also celebrate the poems of the poet. That will not go away. That will not die. They will continue its course. The poetry of the poet is unaffected by his death. They are like the wolves running along the evergreen forest, like the peasant river. Now what is this peasant river? Countryside river, that are not tempted by the ocean or tempted by the quay. It is quay, pronounced quay, okay. Quay, that is the harbour, Thuramukha Meda or Kappal Thura, whatever you call it, quay. It does not get tempted by all that. They are pure and they will run on its course. They don't get engulfed. Okay. Now let's look at the next few lines. But for him it was the last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumours. It means that the last afternoon of Yeats as a living man, as himself. Here, as himself means as a human being in the living world. A description of his physical condition on the last day of his life is portrayed here. His body was in a state of degeneration. There were different rumors and news about his death or his condition that afternoon. Nurses and doctors, they busied themselves around the patient. They gave reports of his health. The news circulated far and wide. Some were true reports, but some others speculations. People were talking of sick Yeats, and different views, or in fact different rumors, were being expressed. Again, I want to draw your attention to the word rumor. It may be pertinent to recall that Arden, as a social protest poet, is also trying or bringing in or alluding to, indirectly referring to the European politics of the day. Europe during the period of world wars was full of rumors and political happenings. Now the next few lines of the poem. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs, the current of his feeling failed, he became his admirers. In this metaphysical conceit, the dying W.B. Yeats is compared to an emperor, to a king. Different parts of his body are the provinces or states or small kingdoms or states, provinces of his empire, and they refuse to follow his will. That is, they are all degenerating. The body parts are degenerating. So there is a metaphysical conceit here. The body, or Yeats, is compared to an emperor, and the different parts of his body are the provinces or states. Squares are different parts of his mind. The squares of his mind, which means mental faculties, were all nullified or emptied. They cannot think. They lose their power of thinking. And the outlying body parts, or the outlying parts of the body, which in the poem is the suburbs, that is, a suburb means outlying or outskirts, they too become silent. That means the main organs of the body has already failed him, and therefore it has caused a silence in less important parts, the suburbs, which are less important parts, because the main organs have failed. Like in the lines, when the telephone lines are cut, or there is no the communication. In a communication in a country ceases to flow, we are all in darkness, and the poet gradually dies. So there is a using this metaphysical conceit, the various parts of his body, the decaying various parts of his body is brought out. Okay, final death happens. The suggestion of what is happening in Yeats's body may not be fair, but Arden has used these conceits to parallel the dying spasms of Europe as a state. Europe was infested by the winter of discontent, the same sort of disillusionment that affected the dying man. Society was affected, religion was affected, politics was affected, war was impending. Christianity, which held Europe together, was slowly losing its hold. The bloodthirsty leaders of Europe were threatening each other. Nations lived in isolation. They were in constant fear of each other. Their hearts were entirely devoid of human sympathy. It was a period of disintegration and decay. Thus, the image of Yeats's death and his physical body and the body's decay are paralleled with the European condition of the day, and this is a magnificent image. Now, the elegiac conventions of universal mourning is also brought in with politics and humanistic overtones. Next, in another very startling and very trenchant phrase, we are told that he became his admirers. Now, what does that mean? This means that he will be what people think of him and his poetry. He became his admirers. It is an epigrammatic style. Yeats' poetry has now an independent existence, quite distinct from his personal life, intentions and aspirations. The words of the poet, when published, belong to his admirers or readers. Now let's look at the next few lines. Now he is scattered among 100 cities, up to unfamiliar affection. His poetry is spread far and wide over the countries of the world, like the ashes of the dead. Henceforth, it will be read in unfamiliar, unknown countries, unjudged and sometimes even condemned by foreign tastes and standards. So his poetry will be circulated far and wide. In this way, his poetry will be modified, understood by many differently. It will be modified by the living. Though his poetry itself could not change either the course of nature or the course of human life. His poetry will be read, however. It will be appreciated in faraway countries with different culture, different situations, different outlooks on life. But even away from the context of Irish nationalism and Yeats's personal charisma, his poetry will continue. It will continue to stir the minds of the discerning reader. Now, if you look at the phrase, punished under a foreign code conscience, which means it is judged and perhaps reprimanded under alien code of conscience by different country, by different nationals. When we read Yeats's poem, we may either accept or even reject his poems, because the words of the dead, his art, is always modified, and always you have different perspectives, and these different perspectives will continue to move on as long as there is life on earth, as long as his poems are read by various people, not just Irish people, not just English people, not just the European countries, but spread far and wide across the globe, the Asian countries, the African countries. We take it as we read. We take it in different light, different perspective. So again, he comes to a very important statement. A dead poet will or can be judged against the background which molded his genius. That is the situation that made him one. But however, the living future generation will continue to modify and interpret his words according to their codes of conscience. You can't expect them to understand the poet or the dead poet or base it on the situations and background in which he lived. When we read the poem, it is our code of conscience that brings in perspectives or brings in meaning to his poems. The personal and other motives which inspired Yeats will no longer be relevant to us or relevant to the living, and hence the words of the poet undergoes the necessary and inevitable modifications to interpretations in the hands of the living. These lines are metaphysical in nature. It has a hidden conceit. The simple meaning is that Yeats's poetry no longer needs the assistance of his personal life to be appreciated by coming generations. What Yeats was in his personal life, what Yeats did for his country, for his nation, what was his upbringing, his personal problems, his traumas, nothing is relevant to the future generation. His poetry is very strong. They don't require the assistance of his personal life to be appreciated, to be judged. Okay, so that is the meaning. Now, if you look at the next few lines, but in the importance and noise of tomorrow, a few thousand will think of this day. Even though Yeats's poetry will survive his death and can do without him, while the world goes on in its habitual routine, pursuing its business and conflicts, there is a there are few very important phrases here. Look at the first one, the importance and noise of tomorrow. Now, what does that mean? Life stands still today, but tomorrow life will proceed. And every action is filled with important and consequent bustle. It is very important and also a bitter contrast to this day of death when the body of Yeats has been immobilized. The brokers are rearing like beasts. Now, it is to suggest the normalcy of life. The speculators are referred to as bulls in the language of stock market. So the word, that is why you have used the word bees. The bourse is the Paris Stock Exchange. So what it actually mean here is that Yeats's death may have had its impact on several people, but whatever it is, life will continue as it is. The poet is dead. His body is immobilized, but that is not going to affect the life. Life will move on the same way. You will find business in the market as usual. The poor, if you look at the poor will still have their sufferings, and the people are still the same, selfish as ever. Yeats has always addressed this problem in his poems. The theme of inequality, injustice, war, politics, very important themes of Yeats' poems. He was worried of the way life progressed, the sufferings of the people, all that terrified him. So nothing in life or nature is changed by the death of the poet. There's nothing. The death of the poet? Yeah. Don't feel that through the death of the poet, there is going to be a lot of change in life. No, life will be the same. It's going to be the same. The poor gets poorer and the rich gets richer. People are selfish. It's the same. In the cell of himself, look at that phrase, next one, look at that phrase, in the cell of himself. This means that a person is a prisoner of his own selfishness, his own ego. A prisoner of his own self will continue to harbor the delusion that he is always free, or that he will be free. He feels that one day he shall be free. But the funniest part is that freedom is never found. The poor will continue to suffer and they will accept all the sufferings without questioning the rich. Humanity and liberty will continue to be in danger, but the people are already reconciled to it. They're okay with it. So Arden says that there's nothing going to change. Nothing is going to change. Everything is as it is. But again, in the midst of all this, a few sensitive people who still believes in humanity, they will remember the great loss sustained by humanity in the death of the poet. The day of his death was indeed a dark, cold day for all sensitive people, for all good people, for all those who believe in selflessness. Thus, Arden beautifully brings in the inevitability of death. One must die. Life must go on. Life will be the same. There's no point. Inevitability of death. Just because one person is dead doesn't mean that life stops. Life moves on without caring for the dead. So Arden beautifully brings in that theme, the inevitability of death and the continuance of life in a very true elegic fashion. So we'll stop here and we shall continue the next section. We have completed the first section and we'll take up the second section and the third section in the next video. So thank you and keep safe.